All right, how's it going, everybody? Welcome to week 2 here, moving right along. So last week we sort of got the what was going on in circa 1500, east and west, which your Padlets did a good job of explaining. So the point of that was kind of put yourself in history, be from Spain or Portugal, be thinking about different why. Asks some on some people's questions or responses, but first, why are you going? Why are you leaving? What's this motivation? And that kind of relates to that idea of multi-causality. There were a lot of things going on in Europe at the time that were people wanted to leave. Some for new opportunities, some for trade, economic. Some just for the adventure of it because it was there. And what allowed this, people who did Portugal, I liked how you sort of traced how you went. Some people even talked about the different wind systems, the monsoon system or the Volta del Mar of the Atlantic. So good, good on that. And then also, what you encountered there. So using those primary sources to help you kind of work your way through those responses. We're good. We're going to do primary sources are important. We have some more for this week as well as we get into the Americas. So we're kind of focusing on the West here, the Americas. Lecture sort of talk about what was going on prior to 1492, what these worlds were. A little bit of history of settling of the Americas as well as Oceania, because both those regions were integrated into larger world connections after this period of time. And then the Spanish and the Aztecs, I talked about that. There's a nice little link to the 3D sort of rendering of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, what it looked like sort of at the height. And the Aztecs, that's one thing about sort of this, the Aztecs were relatively new. They had just sort of started to consolidate their power, making all of these alliances. There were a lot of people that didn't like the Aztecs. That's where the Spanish come in. Sometimes this history has been written that Spanish, just because of their guns and horses, they're able to just kind of go over the Aztecs. But really, in the case was the Spanish had translators. Martina, I think is his name, Matzalin, who could speak Mayan and Spanish, and then from Mayan found people who speak Nahuatl, so they could communicate back and forth. And they realized, hey, there's this big empire there. We don't like them. Join with us, right? And we'll help you defeat them if you help us. And then they were. And then they did. They go to Tenochtitlan. They had to leave. They were kicked out. And then this disease comes through. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And that's when the Spanish were able to sort of overthrow the Aztecs and establish this empire there. And then kind of replicated that down in the south with the Incas. And that established the Spanish Empire, which the Spain really sort of were the only European group in the Americas for about a century. Until later on in North America, the British showed up in Virginia, in the East Coast, and then France up north. Even Amsterdam in what is now Manhattan, New York City, was where the Dutch were. So that's kind of the North America, and in the review terms, I sort of talked about in the lecture sort of the difference of colonization, if you will, encounters there. Primary sources talk about that as well. So kind of what the Spanish saw, some of the, in the Spanish Empire, when they started going in, they were very brutal towards these indigenous peoples. De las Casas examines that, talks about that, tries to pass some laws to protect indigenous peoples. North America, we have that sort of interesting connection between John Smith and Powhatan ruler there, kind of how the interactions there. And then the last primary source, also very interesting, sort of early encounters or observations by settlers in Massachusetts, and they're at awe that these entire villages are there with stocked with food and have crops there. They're like, oh, God provided for us. But no, actually, those were indigenous native villages that had been sort of decimated by disease. People had fled and allowed for a lot of people to move in there. So that's kind of the America side. Oceania, similar sort of phases of expansion there. Magellan being one of the first, who ends up getting killed in the Philippines. And then later on, Cook is much larger, sends a lot more sort of expansion, looking to understand the Oceania a little more, but brings it in and then ultimately gets killed here on the Big Island, or on the Kona side. Kealakekua. Bay. We talked about that, and there's a nice little a link to that too. That a Hawaiian historian through the British, using these records from the British Museum, kind of put together a page which I thought was pretty interesting about kind of looking at this moment in time a little bit. So you can click on that as well. And then the last part of that is really sort of what changes. What, and some people talk about this as sort of the altering to the contemporary modern world, was what's called Columbian exchange. Is the exchange of products between these two different regions. The old world, sometimes it's called, with Africa, Europe, and Asia, that had been in contact through the Silk Road for a long time, and these new worlds of Americas and Oceania. And with that exchange of products, which we see today, I mean, that's one of the questions is, think about the food you eat. A lot of that is directly related to the Columbian exchange, right? That Europe didn't have potatoes or tomatoes. There was no Italian food. There were no French fries, until a little bit later, until, corn. Corn was only found in the Americas. And then conversely, things, particularly a lot of domesticated animals that Europe and the Americas and Oceania didn't have. Cows, horses, pigs, sheep, goats, right, were introduced. And that kind of, and so, you can kind of say, sorry, just kind of getting ahead of myself, but, this idea of these Indians riding around on horses, chasing buffaloes, prior to 1500, that didn't exist. There were no horses. There was a horse that was native to the Americas, but that died out, most likely with the first groups of humans arriving. And then one of the things of that is because of the lack of sort of domesticated animals, they think that's one of the explanations of why certain types of diseases weren't around in the Americas. So one of the cons, the negative effects of Columbian exchange is introduction of these diseases that ravaged indigenous populations, up to, it's estimated, 90%, smallpox being one of the most insidious ones. The thing about that is you were contagious even if you didn't have a little pock on you. But the minute those things broke out, then you were, you had a matter of a week before you died. It's like, really, really a lot of, the percentage of people dying is over 50%. So it just decimated these. And that's just one of many that came through. That the Europeans and because they'd been introduced to stuff from Africa and Asia, had a lot more immunities because there had been movement back and forth between these groups. So, so the cons of that, the disease, the impact of disease. And the other side of that, right, is that increased diets around the world, the pros of that as well. So kind of a back and forth with that. But it really alters societies on a global scale, with some societies being decimated in the Americas and Oceania. You can look at Hawaii, the population decline in Hawaii, and that happened throughout the Pacific as well, and the Americas. But then the introduction of new foods as well with that. So I think that's it. That's kind of the summary of this week. So this week is a discussion post. There's 3 questions. Just answer one of those, please. You don't need to answer all 3. Somebody here is going to do that, and I'm going to say just answer one. So don't do that. I think that's it. If you have questions on the discussion post, again, use the course materials. You don't need to bring in anything outside. In fact, please don't. Just show me that you've engaged with the course materials in your discussion post.